Hi, everyone. It's Kate Kay. I'm back with another of our Fireside Chat series. We are super fortunate today to be joined by Lisa, and we are going to be talking about vicarious trauma, which I know is something that has come up in a lot of our work. So thank you, Lisa, for joining us today. I really appreciate your time. Do you want to give like a little introduction to the group?
Sure, thank you. So my name is Lisa Petrocchi Merriman, and I am a psychotherapist and a coach, mindset coach. I've been working in the field of trauma and providing trauma therapy and treatment to survivors of trauma for nearly 20 years. I worked in a child abuse forensic intervention center and worked as a child abuse interviewer and worked with FBI, law enforcement, testified in court, and then also provided treatment for children and their families for, in this space for 20 years. So I'm very familiar with how trauma affects a person's brain, their mind, and then also their physical self.
Okay. I thank you for your background. It makes me, I hope that you're okay doing that kind of work. It sounds really heavy. Just as someone who's been doing it for a year. So thank you for your time.
Sure.
You were kind enough, Lisa, to give me a little chat outline. And for everyone else, usually I don't have these. So if you see me looking to the side, I'm not disregarding our lovely guest here. I'm just trying to keep things on track. So the first thing that I did want to ask you was, we use the term vicarious trauma a lot. And I find that some people don't necessarily understand what that is. So would you mind just giving us like a little bit of a definition or a background?
Sure. And by the way, this subject matter is near and dear to my heart because I lived it. And I think that there's a real insidious dynamic to vicarious trauma. I wonder, Kate, can we maybe first of all talk about the definition of psychological trauma?
Of course.
Okay. So I think that's helpful so that it's kind of a foundational way of looking at what your volunteers, the people that they are rescuing, what those people are experiencing, and then how it affects your volunteers with the vicarious trauma piece. So the brief definition of psychological trauma is a trauma response to a deeply distressing or disturbing event that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope, causes feelings of helplessness, diminishes their sense of self and their ability to experience their full range of emotions and experiences of life again. Okay. So it ends up overwhelming, like how we make decisions, being able to keep things straight, those kinds of pieces. Now, what I also think is really important to define is that there are three main types of trauma: acute, chronic, and complex. And more than likely, your volunteers are helping individuals who've experienced maybe all three of these types of trauma, including the current terror of evacuation. So these Afghani individuals, people, families may experience acute trauma results from a single incident, or chronic trauma that is repeated and prolonged, such as domestic violence, war, abuse, and complex trauma, an exposure to varied and multiple types of traumatic events, often invasive and interpersonal in nature. So that all sounds pretty clinical and kind of dry. But the one, there's a neuropsychiatrist who I adore and I follow his work, and his work actually saved me and how I provided treatment for my clients. And his name is Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. He is an MD and a neuropsychiatrist. He wrote the book, The Body Keeps the Score. He and his teams took a look at veterans of war and understood what was going on in the brain by having fMRIs of volunteer veterans. And in various, fight, flight, and then in calm mode. So he and his teams put together how to actually provide sustainable and helpful types of treatment as well. So he describes trauma as the moment an individual has the experience of absolute terror, believing that they are facing imminent death and or fears imminent death is coming, or is witness to another individual who is having that, surviving that situation. So some examples of that might be a horrific car accident, physical violent attacks that from a person or from an animal, sexual assault, surviving a medical crisis, or surviving your child's medical crisis, natural disaster, surviving that, escaping war, surviving human trafficking. Those are just some of those moments. But in this culture, we just throw around the term, oh, that was so traumatic, but that's not really what it means.
Right.
And some people in my coaching, sometimes people are saying, I'm having trauma, but it's actually a panic attack.
Okay.
And they are having like acute distress. Okay. Different. Their lives were never in danger and they never felt like their life was in danger. So I love van der Kolk's ability to parse that out. Okay. So this is what your volunteers are experiencing from the people they help every day, right? And this is a heavy allostatic load. So now what I want to also tease out is when there's a lot of shared symptoms between burnout and vicarious trauma. And so in my 20 years at the pediatric clinic, sometimes I thought, yay, oy vey, I must be burned out.
Yeah.
Most of us at the clinic, really amazing doctors and nurses and other therapists who were so amazing intellectually and noble and compassionate. And yet we were all struggling with the various types of symptoms. And I think most of us maybe thought we were burned out or just needed a vacation, but yet could never make it time to schedule a vacation. So we just kept slogging through, right? So burnout is generally something that happens over time and builds up as a change, such as, a different job can maybe improve that sense of burnout. Okay. So it's kind of a situational thing. Okay. Vicarious trauma is a state of tension and preoccupation with the stories and trauma experiences that the people they work with describe to them. This tension and preoccupation might be experienced by rescue workers in several ways. They might avoid talking or thinking about what the affected client may have been talking about, maybe almost going numb to what the client was describing or images they had sent, or be persistent in a hyper-arousal state of danger or crisis. So the volunteer worker, and I really identified with this, especially when my children were school age, I was a nervous wreck. So I had that hyper-arousal state, like we couldn't even go to a zoo concert. Okay. But that's okay. I was a good mom.
Yeah.
So no, my children were not on leashes or anything like that, but they did have a whistle. They had a whistle necklace.
Got it.
Yay. So there are some resilient ways around this that we'll get into in our next conversation. But let me continue with defining vicarious trauma. According to the American Counseling Association, vicarious trauma has maybe different names. So in 1995, it showed up as secondary traumatic stress. Okay. And then there's secondary victimization. Okay. And now a new term that you might hear is trauma exposure response. Okay. And that kind of came out in 2009. So volunteer workers working with trauma survivors might experience trauma in one of these ways. Vicarious trauma is the emotional residue of exposure that volunteers have working with people that they are hearing the traumatic stories of and become witnesses to that person's pain, fear.
I just want to offer or ask, I think, one clarifying question, because what I hear a lot from some of the volunteers in this space is that you can only really have that vicarious trauma if you are actively present in the moment of the trauma. So we're seeing where, for example, we're here, like most of our volunteers are based here in the States, and a lot of our, the people, the allies that we're working with are in Afghanistan or third-party countries. And so there's this notion of we're not with them. And so how can we really take on that trauma? So when you say we're witnessing it, like, is just really being party to it in any capacity, does that constitute vicarious trauma?
That's a great question, Kate. So Yes.
You guys heard it. You got to listen.
So when, and I say yes because now I'm not a psychiatrist, certainly, but I'm a trained therapist and specialized in trauma treatment. And I'll give you an example. I had a family come into the pediatric center, and the evaluation team worked with the 4-year-old little girl, and that's who our client was. But I worked with her grandfather, who was now her caregiver. I had a little, counseling room. He came in with me and he recounted this horrific scene. He recounted coming in to his daughter's apartment and seeing this horrible scene where she had been murdered, essentially, and the 4-year-old had been in the bedroom. And so our teams were hoping that maybe she could provide and shed some light. So we also had law enforcement there and all of those things. When I sat with this grieved grandfather, he was recounting the scene that he visualized and in such detail, but he was kind of blanked out. Mm-hmm. Even though my name tag said Lisa, he kept calling me honey. And he barely registered that I was in the room. Yeah. And so he was having a dissociative moment, and that's okay. That's what he needed to do. And he was flooding, so he was going to keep talking about it. He didn't include his emotions. In fact, he said, I kept warning her. I kept telling her, she never listened to me. So he kind of got into a scolding thing. It was very interesting, but I now had a picture. So it does transfer. I was his witness, and I might have been like only the second or third person he talked to about this. Now, what was interesting is that even though I worked with a team of 6 other highly trained therapists, I felt like I couldn't share it. Mm-hmm. Now, why did I think that? I didn't want to emotionally or mentally affect or infect any of my colleagues. Yes. So I kept it to myself. Another interesting thing that happened at the clinic was that when cases came in or were going to be scheduled to come in, the more intense they were and the more maybe horrific they were, people were like, oh, I want to be on that case. So interesting. This I can handle anything. Yeah. I am ready to go. Nothing defeats me. I'm here. I'm rock solid, which is fantastic, right? But all along, I don't think we realized how an overall marinating in that type of destruction to humanity can actually kind of saturate who you are and then how you see the world. So again, going back to my vision now that I had in my mind, I didn't even want to talk to say a therapist about it. Right. I didn't want to have anyone have this image in my mind. So I also then had a whole new picture for what veterans have gone through and go through, law enforcement, FBI. And so then what I needed to do was figure out how to work on myself to make sure I didn't interrupt anyone else. And that was also my way of holding everyone else up, but it just wasn't very realistic. Right. And so our team struggled with how to support ourselves without looking like we're the weak one.
Oh, Lisa, I know that there's more, but I do just want to highlight something for, the members of our group who are listening, because you said something that touched me, which was just, it's okay to experience this kind of trauma, right? It's kind of natural when you're thinking about the kind of horrific things that, our volunteers have been going through. It makes sense. Right. And that notion of, I can't share it with other people because that means letting it in and perhaps being too flooded to feel like I can function, or I don't want to bring other people down. Right. These are, I understand them to be coping mechanisms, but they're not necessarily helpful ones, especially when we're in a long-term crisis environment, which is what we're in. So just to anyone who is listening, I just really want to highlight that piece, which is that it's okay to have that vicarious trauma. It's natural and it makes sense. And the only thing that we can really do is to put yourself in a better position to manage it. But I just want everyone to take a minute to give yourselves permission to like sit with that and to feel what you're feeling.
Right.
Apologies for interrupting. Yeah.
No, that's okay. That was going to be the next thing, is that
great.
to validate for people anything that you're thinking, feeling, recalling, remembering is 100% completely normal. There's nothing wrong with how you're going about this. This is kind of uncharted waters for most of humanity. And I want you to know that you're not alone, though. And that's the thing that also happens, is that people end up feeling kind of siloed with their own internal imagery and or stories and information. So it's also really normal to have a numbing effect. Because there's only so much we can take in with our sensory, who we are and how we're developed and wired as humans. There's only so much kind of brutality and violence we can actually take in. And then the mind tries to take care of us by numbing things out. Right. So that might seep out in other ways, like maybe increased drinking or inability to sleep. So I'll get to some of those symptoms in a second. Yes. I do want to read like a little bit more about trauma exposure response. And it's defined as a transformation that takes place within us as a result of the exposure of suffering of other living beings or the planet. Warning signs can be feeling helpless and hopeless. Those are the two main identifiers. So I remember thinking at one point, being on an airplane, like, how many people here have ever had experiences as a child who've been traumatized? Like, I can't go anywhere right now without like worrying about how many people need help or how many people have been injured. And that is, I was on overload and I didn't know that at the time. And that's also the insidious nature, is that we're not born with that checklist that goes, oh, that's silly, or, oh, that's maybe, I should go talk to somebody or go for a run or pray or meditate or what have you. We don't have that. So we're doing that now, right? So no matter what it's called, the impact is still the same. When we refer to traumatic exposure response, we're talking about the ways in which the world looks and feels like a different place to you as a result of doing your work. And that's a quote from Laura Vandernoot Lipsky, who wrote the book Trauma Stewardship. And we'll get more into her work next conversation. So, burning, oh, I love this. She talks about her own work as, I realized eventually that I had come into my work armed with a burning passion and a tremendous commitment. So how many of you identify with that as you started your work? I certainly identify with that. Yeah. And, but even though with that tremendous passion and commitment, she realizes that she had few internal resources. And that's our society, that's our culture, really. And as you know, she goes on, there's a time for fire, but what sustains the heat for a long haul is the coals. And she admits, I didn't have any coals. So that is the work right there, is like, how do we sustain our own fire without completely, like a tube of toothpaste, crushing ourselves, right? So there are ways to do that. And I'm really happy to be part of this conversation so that I can help out with that, because I do, this is something that moves me. Your work is very moving to me. So interpersonally, you might see vicarious trauma show up as maybe conflict coming up, people not getting along, people not understanding each other. Maybe perhaps you don't feel understood or misunderstood a lot. And then when that typically happens, people feel like, I'm going to dig my heels in and make sure somebody gets my point, right? And I'm not backing down. So where we feel hopeless, helpless, we start to overcorrect and do that in other settings and other situations. And that, to the outside observer, it might look a little bit irrational. So we don't have that ability to gauge how we're coming across when we're in a vicarious trauma. Okay.
I'm also wondering, this might be off base here, but one of the things I've seen a lot of in the last year is also sort of such a burden of guilt in people who are experiencing this trauma that they then feel like they can't go on and enjoy their actual lives. Like they just feel so guilty because they understand what's happening in other parts of the world to people that they care about. And then, you know, they go to their kids' soccer game and they just
the reality is so weird.
Yeah. And so I'm wondering if that's also part of it. It's just that sense of like, oh, I can't function in the world as I live in it, because I understand that it's different for somebody else.
Right. Wow. That's a really good point. Yes, Kate. What you're talking about is survivor guilt. Okay. And so it is a real thing that happens. And you're right. It's absolutely that strange juxtaposition of two different, very different realities of terror, violence, and pleasure. Right. And how can we allow ourselves to do that? So we can kind of maybe get to that. We'll see how far we get through this, and maybe I can go back and address that, because that is very real and it keeps people up at night. And then on top of that, we shame ourselves for like, how can I possibly enjoy this moment, or what's wrong with me? A lot of people are dying and suffering. This is so wrong. And then there's no way to make sense of it. So again, we can talk about that next time, but being able to meditate so you can be in the moment where you are. And that sounds oversimplified, but there's information.
We'll give some tips on that next time, y'all. So make sure you tune in.
No, sorry about that. Yeah, I wish there was more I could say right now. So anyway, I'll go on to some of these other symptoms. Blaming others for what's going on is very much also a trauma response, just in general, or when you're in fight flight, blaming others is right there. So vicarious trauma, nothing different there. Conflictual engagement, which is also what you were just talking about. Relationships and the quality of your relationships start to suffer because you're not fully present, you're kind of numbed out. And I relate to that. My husband has said, you know, you're not all here. Like when I worked with that grandfather, he's like, oh my gosh, you know, tell me what happened. I said, no, just hold me. Every once in a while, he'd say, you're not here. And I'd say, okay, just give me a big squeeze because you're right. And I'm not going to tell you what happened. Poor communication happens because people just don't want to. And you're kind of like, it's kind of like your head's been blown out of your mind and you don't realize you're not communicating. So that you're not doing it wrong. These are just ideas of things to keep in mind about, oh, maybe I'm having an uptick in like my vicarious trauma. Being impatient more than normal. Some personal values and beliefs might get askew as well. So like overwhelming dissatisfaction with your life or situations, loss of interest in things that you normally enjoyed. And here's where people can also get into depression, apathy, blaming others again, lack of appreciation of life or things that are going on for you, detachment, hopelessness, sometimes a low self-image. Just we kind of put ourselves at the bottom of the deck. That's what I was doing. And I ended up with an autoimmune disease that was so bizarre and difficult to diagnose at first. Job performance, you know, your regular work might kind of suffer. You might end up feeling low motivation. You might not be aware of errors you might be making, a decrease in quality that you usually put forth. And again, you're not doing it wrong. It's just a result of carrying this heavy, heavy load. In your personal life, you might find that you might be dropping out of groups that you usually attend or enjoyed. You might want to avoid going out alone, or maybe so you just kind of hole up in the house. Reject physical or emotional or sexual closeness. That's where, you know, people in my life suffered a little bit. Either my kids got like too much attention, like, okay, we're safe. We're just in the backyard. My husband's like, hello, you're not here. So that's all normal. So how trauma response, I like these quotes to kind of humanize this a little bit. So rather than staying in touch with the heart that was breaking again and again, as a result of what I had heard, I started to build up walls, like a shield. Yeah, makes sense?
You're speaking to the very heart of what we're seeing in our community right now. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's really difficult. And it's also very tender for me and touching. I felt that. I experienced that. The more walls I had up, I felt invincible. And I do wonder if there's opiates that go along with that. It's like a reward system. Man,
Yeah, right.
I can power through this. Oh,
I've never felt better.
The more horrific the case that came in, I want that. Like we were like arm wrestling to like, what is wrong with us?
It's a quote, you know, people think it speaks to their strength and
yes, right. Yeah, absolutely. This also meant for Laura Vandernoot Lipsky writes these quotes. She also says that, and I love these because it's like, oh, wow, yeah, I identify with that as well. So building up her walls meant for her in becoming increased cockiness, you know, like I can handle anything. You're a wimp. Really? That's a problem for you? Step aside kind of thing. And then she says she had no access to the humility that she needed to own her internal process, which is a step by step.
It's interesting. Sometimes I'll experience both simultaneously. So like, I'll go through that feeling of being like, wow, I have really failed here. I cannot get this right. But then I'm also arrogant enough to be like, give me another. I can definitely handle this in front of you guys. And it's like, what? I believe them both equally, but they don't make any sense.
Right. So that's that experience confusion thing that I talked about. Yeah. And that's a little bit of cognitive dissonance too, where like your belief system doesn't really match up with what's going on. and you're saying, yes, I'll have another serving, please. Come on.
Yeah, I've got something to prove. And Lisa, I hate to do this, but we're a little bit over. And I do want to, I don't want to interrupt you because this is so critical to our work. So is there anything else that we haven't hit yet that we want to get to? Because I want to make sure that we don't skip anything.
Okay. No, I was really close to, there was just one last thing.
Of course.
I could. Okay. So the last thing that Laura talks about is rather than acknowledging my own pain and helplessness in the face of things I could not control, because that's really what it's all about. It's staggering the amount of need and you can't control it. So she became more dogmatic and opinionated. She says it never occurred to her that her anger was functioning as a shield. So just keep that in mind. She didn't have any clue that she was warding off anguish and pain. And she was secretly terrified that maybe her life would fall apart too. So if you feel like you're hanging on by a thread, that's actually an illusion. But your system is overwhelmed. So once you can deal with your system, that sense of helplessness is going to start to go away. So a last quote I want to leave you with is from Sharon Salzberg, and she's an author and she's a meditation expert. She says, resilience is based on compassion for ourselves as well as compassion for others, which is kind of difficult to do. I laugh a little bit because it's very difficult to do, but it can be done. And it just means going about it in a slightly different way. There's nothing wrong with the way you're going about it. Everything you're thinking, once again, and feeling is completely normal, given the trauma that is just an avalanche on you every day. And you're some of the strongest and most resilient people there. And I'm so glad that you're out there doing the work. So,
thank you, Lisa. Yeah, the thing that you said that struck me was about having some empathy. You know, obviously these people come into this work because they're empathetic individuals, like they want to help other people. Absolutely. And it's so interesting the way that sometimes we will prevent ourselves from showing that to ourselves, right? Like, and so in the last year, I had to get in the habit of saying, you know, is this what I would be telling my friend? Like, is this what I would be telling them if I was giving them advice, or would I be coming down on them with a lot more kindness than I'm coming on myself? And so that sort of made me stop and say, okay, maybe I'm not sort of understanding the situation the way that I would, but I actually had to have these conversations as though I was speaking to someone else because I couldn't turn the empathy on myself. And that helped a lot, but it felt ridiculous for a little bit. It felt really, really silly, but it's what I needed to do.
Oh no, Kate, I think that's so creative and really cool, actually. Any way you can get the self-compassion and self-care in there is right on. I mean, I had to have an autoimmune disorder where it was a traveling arthritis. I couldn't even drive my car. I was grounded, literally grounded. And I just work myself to the ground.
Yeah.
And that is so wrong. I had to reconstitute and actually, more than ever before, walk the walk that I treated others with. And that had to be taking care of myself and honoring the warrior that I had to be, or that I allowed myself to have to be for these children and families. And that is what your volunteers are. They're warriors out there. You're a warrior too. And so to find a way to have to, honor and take good care of that warrior. Yeah, that you are.
That really resonates. So for everyone, for everyone who is watching, we're going to have another session with Lisa, which I'm really, really excited about, especially after talking to you today. And so we'll be talking about trauma resilience. And Lisa, did you want to give like a little preview to people about why they should tune in or what that means?
Oh gosh, yes, sure. So trauma resilience is going to be about the actual steps that you can take, easy steps to implement into your life so that you can start to nourish yourself again and give yourself back the color in your life. And again, it will take some time, but at least we can have an introduction to that. And then I'll have references that I can give to Kate, and you can look them up.
I will pass them along to everyone. And guys, that should encourage you, because I know that sometimes thinking about our trauma responses can feel overwhelming, but we're hearing from Lisa that there are ways that we can adjust. So we'll get into that for our next session. Lisa, I always like to end on the same question, and it's maybe something you've already hit on, but I like to ask if you could leave our viewers with one message or one thing, what would it be?
Yes, it's that I know that you can find your inner resilience for yourself. All that you give to others, you will find that pool for yourself as well. And hang in there. And thank you for all the work that you're doing. I guess it's.
Oh, Lisa, this has just been like 30 minutes of validation for our team. I think it's really going to matter to like a lot of people. So I'm excited to talk to you next session, and thank you for today. And if you're all ready, I'll go ahead and I can stop recording.
Sure. Thank you.
All right, guys. Thank you for tuning in.